Welcome once again to Arctic Fire. This unique gathering of swordsmiths explores the outer edge of the craft, where craftsmanship, artistry, storytelling, history, and myth combine. This year, the group has recreated objects found in the legendary hoard of Grendel, from the most ancient surviving poem in Old English, Beowulf. 4 days of live broadcast, in which legends will be reborn. Arctic Fire 2016, Grendel's Hoard.
I'm going to attempt today to remake the tip of the giant sword Undertow that I forged in steel. I'm going to be using plasticine as a medium to make this for a very obvious reason. That's that I spent something like 15 or 20 days forge welding that great big lump of metal together, and I have an hour or so now to show you how it works. If whilst I'm working, anyone in the audience out there notices that they do not understand what's going on, throw me a question, and maybe that with the plasticine in front of me I can explain things if I've omitted something. I have a little bit of from an English point of view, Blue Peter, so here's what I've done earlier part going on here. But I'm going to try and take the separate elements of, in this case, plasticine that's representing different steels and start making the sword blade. I'm going to start with one of the elements of the sword. I tried to incorporate watery patterns into it, so patterns of flowing water and patterns of waves in the sea. And I'm going to start making the wave elements in this piece. So I'm starting with 2 different colours of material. I've got white clay and black clay, and these represent in the sword blade 15N20 and 1080 steel. So if for argument's sake we call the dark material here 1080 and the light material 15N20, in pattern weld what I'm trying to do when I'm playing with different steels is I'm trying to take steels that work together in the same way but have different properties when you etch them. So I like to have materials that etch dark and materials that stay very light in the finished piece. And I'm actually going to get the rest of the crew here to help me out and mush together some of this clay here to make me a mid-grey that's going to represent the wrought iron in the finished piece. Yeah, so just squish it out. If you leave lines in it, that's great. It can be silicate stringers. Whilst they're doing that, I'm going to start assembling one of the bars that would be a steel bar in the finished piece. So I've got 12 layers of opposing steels here. Half of it is 15N20, half of it is 1080 for argument's sake. And I'm going to forge weld it together. I'll go over to the anvil and do that. Forge weld it together and fold it. So the plasticine behaves in a very similar way to steel. It forges when you hit it and it pushes together. So it is solid state welding. So I'm forging it down into a piece, folding it in half. It's now 24 layers. I'll fold it in half again to give me 48 layers. And I'm going to go over to one of the pieces that I have made earlier. So this is my 48 layer bar, 12 layers folded twice, and I have a couple of sample pieces here that are the same as that. They're the same amount of material. They've been folded to 48 layers and squared out. What I want to try and do is I want to take these pieces and cut into them to move the layers around and give me a wave pattern in the finished saw blade. So I'm using a dowel to press my teeth in. In reality, I used a 12-ton hydraulic press. To try and move the layers of material, if I move my hand out of the way, you can probably see that we've got waves forming in this bar now. So I'm trying to create waves in the bar, and then we're going to push the wrought iron material that everyone else is smushing together into this forming bar. But before I do that, I need to create some kind of difference in the hardness of the materials. When I forged the sword blade, I took a cold steel piece and I forged hot wrought iron into it. So I'm going to try and emulate that. I don't want to heat this plasticine or it will just turn to really grim liquid on the table. But I'm going to take these pieces out and put them in the freezer for 7 minutes, set an alarm, and we'll come back to this part of the operation in 7 minutes. So as far as I remember, this process in steel took me something like a day and a half. I'm taking the indented material and cutting teeth into it. And whilst I want to end up with a wavy pattern in the finished blade, initially I have to have a very sharp pattern because every action that I do from this point onwards is going to stretch out the pattern that I have.
So Owen, when you're doing this in steel, are you using
I mean, 9-inch angle grinder, yeah, to clean it up. And then maybe files at the bottom. I think I actually ended up taking this and taking it to the corner of a belt grinder to clean the bottom of the lines out as well. So I'm trying to keep the distortion in the pattern that I've forged in here, but clean it up to a sharper shape. And you'll see as soon as we start squishing this together, after it's this part's being frozen and the other part is quite warm, you'll see that the sharp pattern I have here gets stretched out. So it stops being quite so toothy and becomes a sort of rippling wave. And actually, Jake, for the continuity of this, I may get you to come up and cut the other bar for me, if that's all right, as soon as I finish this.
Is that here?
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's perfect. Got some nice silicate stringers going on in it.
Dirty piece. Another pattern that when you look down at this,
Yep.
It's really cool too.
Yeah, I mean, this would be the kind of thing you'd do if you were trying to get a ladder pattern in Damascus.
Yeah.
From the top. I'll just turn that over so you can see it. But what I'm interested in is I'm interested in the pattern from that direction. This is going to be a piece of material that's going on the face of the blade. So we're going to end up seeing that orientation. So if I leave that with
I see
you.
that there so I can emulate it.
So whilst Jake's, this is very much like a cookery program, I like it. Whilst Jake's going on and preparing the pastry, let me know as soon as you've finished and I'll go and put them in the freezer. I'm going to start working on one of the twists. Now I've got a couple of different twist patterns going on in the sword. One of them is very bling, for want of a better word. It's a very bold pattern. And the other one is a very subtle pattern. I'm going to start working on the bold pattern first. So I've taken my material and I've given myself two sort of bars of pattern, two stripes, very near each edge. And what I hope to have in the finished piece with this are loops going up the side of this bar. These edge pieces will be pushed together and then twisted around. When I've twisted this piece, I'm going to cut a section off of everything so you can see how the pieces look whilst I'm going and don't have to wait for the confusing amalgamation of everything to give us a final piece. So I'm going to take this over to the anvil and forge it together. And I don't have to fold this one, I'm just trying to keep the layer representation. I'm going to try and keep it all together, so yeah, no tongs. I'm not going to fold it, I'm just trying to get the whole thing to smush together. Smush it all together, and then I'm going to round it up. Now I do the rounding in hot steel. Under a power hammer I've got formers for rounding metal. I do all my twisting in the round section. A lot of people don't, and certainly some of the historical pieces I look at have evidence that they were twisted in the square. The reason I do it is that if you're taking a round piece of material, the diameter and the radius of the material is equal all the way around. And if you take a square piece, you have a bigger radius from corner to corner than you do from the center of the edge to the middle of the bar. And it tends to make your edges rip. I like to twist stuff very, very tight in steel. One of the limitations of using plasticine as a medium is that you can't twist it quite as tight. But we'll see what I can get away with. So I'm working this material down, and I'm going to have two bars, one that I twist clockwise and one that I twist anti-clockwise.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
Put that in the freezer?
Could you please? And I'll set an alarm. So normally I'd work the cut bars by heating one piece up, but we're going to do the opposite. We're going to harden one layer by putting it in the freezer for 7 minutes. It is very much like a cooking show. I like it. Delia Smith of the blacksmithing world. Not Jamie Oliver. Okay, so I've got my two rounded up sections with their offset double white lines. I'll cut the end so you can just see what's going on in there. And then I'm going to start twisting. As I said, I'm not sure with this material exactly how much twisting I can do, but I want to try and get it relatively even. So I'm going to go clockwise first. I always go clockwise first because I get muddled up if I don't. Every single time I twist, I'll twist clockwise first. And I'm counting in my head, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, starting to rip a little, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That's not 19 full twists, it's 19 easy rotations. If I was twisting it in steel, by hand, I'd count half rotations because that's the easy movement my body has. With this piece, I did it with a hydraulic press. No, sorry, a hydraulic twisting machine. Clockwise, now I'm going anti-clockwise for 19. Seventeen, 18, 19. Even it out. And you can see from the twisting that we end up with a chevron pattern, not much of a pattern going on the surface. What I'm interested in is in what is happening inside these pieces. So these two bars are going to be the core of one side. I'll leave them together like that. I will square them and join them together. So that's one part finished. It looks like it's just straight lines. It looks like it's chevrons on the surface, but when I cut into it, the pattern's going to change somewhat. So those are my core bars for one side. They're going to have the waves on the outside of it. This is what I'd call a Woden's River pattern. I probably could actually cut a bit and show you now and just put it straight back together. So it's looking pretty bland on the surface. If I take a knife and take a grind into this, I'm not going to do this with all the bars because it will end up taking too much time. I'm fairly certain this can just be forge welded back, so my cutting into it won't end up being a permanent thing. When I start looking at the pattern that's going on. So there's the pattern in the bar. The bit that I'm really interested in are these little squiggles around the edge. Now the original bar that I set up here had a large space in the middle that is just dark material, and what I want to do is I want to try and cut into that so that I'm taking a cut into a space where there'll be no pattern in the middle of each of these bars, just loops on the edge. And there's an element of hit and miss to this. When I was forging the giant sword, the area that I managed to get this pattern showing exactly how I wanted it, I etched a little, ground a little, etched a little, ground a little, and I have a feeling that a lot of the original swords of a standard size would have been made that way, where someone was working away, splashing it with a very light acidic material. So I'm going to put this back together now so we can put it into the sword. That's the pattern I'm looking for. The pattern that I call Woden's River. So it's the loops at the edge of the bar, but the way they interact in the middle is like there's disturbance in the middle of a flowing stream. So let's put that back together. I hope I haven't cursed myself. I'm not going to show you the other patterns like that, but it just gives you an idea of what's happening when we cut through a twist. It's a very, very complex, three-dimensional, helical thing that's going on in there that we're just looking to see what it looks like on the surface. So that's the middle of one side of this saw blade. I'm going to have a little look at the other side now. How's my timing going? Got 2 minutes until we work on these. Could I ask you just to warm those bits up for me, please? So we've got material that's going to end up being the toothed bar that's now being put in a forge to heat up. And whilst that's going on, I'm going to start putting together one of the other core pieces. I wanted the sword to have a very, very bling, non-subtle side, and also to have a subtle side. So the subtle side of this sword blade is made up in a very similar manner to how I put that bar together. It's got layers in it. It's got 9 layers, 5 of which are plain steel, white material, 15N20, so the bright steel, and 4 of which are actually 12 layer bars. So if I put these together, what I'm trying to get with this, I'm trying to get a pattern that is in some ways quite subtle, because it's got very fine layers in amongst the bright layers, but has a pattern distribution that's actually quite bold. And in the work that I've done, some of this is the best work that I've done, I think, trying to combine these two sort of macro and micro elements in pattern welding. So you're drawn into it from a distance by a bold pattern, and when you get closer you find there's an awful lot more going on than you imagined. Now this would be a bloody risky thing to weld together under a power hammer, and I'm not sure what it's going to be like with a hand hammer. Let's have a look. So 9 layers with 4 layers in there that are multiples. Yeah.
Could you explain why it's such a risky thing to do on the power hammer?
Yeah, if you would take a billet like this that is much taller than it is wide, it's very likely that whilst you compress it, you'll end up crushing the whole piece. And as soon as that happens, all your force lines are being thrown out, it self-exasperates. It's one of those things that is almost impossible to get back from. Much, much better with a rubber mallet. I'm going to leave that for a minute because it looks like my tooth bars are cooked or frozen. So hold that spot. 9 layers halfway through being forged. Thank you very much. If I could have my hot wrought iron, please. Thank you very much. Perfect. Super smushy. I'll take those bits as well. This is going to be pretty quick. Thank you. So I'm taking wrought iron material here with lots of nice stringy silicates in it and pushing it into the steel. So I'm imagining that this is hot and this is an unheated steel material. I like to use the carbon steel as a former because it's actually pretty hard. Even when you heat it a little bit, these two materials would have a different hardness to them. And I'm literally going to smush it. I'm using smush a lot, but I think it works with plasticine. Push the softer material hope the bench doesn't mind. And that's a pretty good approximation of the hardness differences you would get with not heated carbon steel going into wrought iron and then eventually heated carbon steel going into wrought iron. So I'm trying to get those teeth pushing in. And in the real materials you definitely get the same differential movement of material. The wrought iron is squidging out squidging out over the sides. And I think that'll be enough. So I'll lay that to the side as well. And whilst there's still a bit of heat in this and still a bit of coldness in the other, I'll get them together. The pattern that I'm working on now, this tooth pattern, is a pattern that I've seen on finished spears. You get variations of toothiness in other things. You see it in saxes, but it's not made the same way as this, or at least I don't know of one that is.
So with the saxes that have teeth in them, that have those really, they're almost like a zipper.
Yeah.
Do you think those are individual?
The one that I've actually looked at properly is definitely individual teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty tricksy bits of work. They'd be nice to do at this size. When we talked about making this sword, there were all sorts of ideas about maybe putting ogham in as little teeth and things like that, so, or inlaid runes or stuff like that, but I think it stayed complicated enough without having to go to those extremes. So I now have core pieces for one side of the blade. I'm going to come back to my monumental lump here and forge it down. And actually, this is what it feels like to be a power hammer. What I'm trying to make out of this is enough material to make 3 twisted bars. One of which I'll twist clockwise and 2 of which I'll twist anti-clockwise. And see what's going on at the end there. We've got distortion from forging, but we've got our 4 layers of pattern material and 5 layers of plain. And I'll break these down into Can I grab your assistance again, Jake? Just a squish.
Just out like this?
Yeah, like that. So drawing this material out again to twist clockwise and anti-clockwise and get opposing patterns. To square, and then it's going to strengthen up your arm, isn't it?
Yeah.
And in this pattern, in the sword, I wasn't looking for any specific depth. This is a pattern that's going to hopefully look pretty cool if it's ground into a tool. And if it works, will give me the combination that I want of subtlety and bling at the same time. Okay, so 3 bars. Going to start twisting clockwise. So that's 10 clockwise. And then anti-clockwise. And each half twist that I do, each half rotation, is going to end up giving a star in the finished pattern. Anti-clockwise. What I'm looking for are, on the surface of this, opposing chevrons. So we've got a pattern that's going down, up, and down again. Now, when I made the sword blade, initially I thought that I'd have just opposing chevrons, but it didn't seem to have enough interest in it. So in the actual sword, I took some bars of 24 layers. I've taken a 12 piece and folded it over on itself to give me 24 parallel layers, and I put them in between, just to give something else that's going on there. So we're kind of looking at the two sides of my saw blade here, the two core pieces. I'll put them together, then I'll start working on the edge. So the bits that I've got here represent the pattern on this side of the sword blade, with 3 twists and two parallel lines. Let's take them over. This is a very risky forge weld. Very, very high compared to its width. The size of the material made it feel okay. There's a relationship between the width of the material and the height of it. I read an architecture book that was talking about stability in structures, and I think the general rule is that if something is more than 3 times higher than it is wide, then the force that you put into it will try and push itself out the side of the material rather than compress it, and it certainly works with steel like that. So if you start getting really, really wide pieces, really high pieces, you've got to be very, very careful. And it's one of those things that if it goes wrong, you're stuffed.
Could you comment about the force of the blows and the effect of the weight of the hammer when you do that kind of...
Yeah, normally I do most of my forge welding on a 50 kilo hammer, but a very gentle 50 kilo hammer. And when I changed the scale up to working with this, I started working with a 100 kilo hammer, so a 225 pound power hammer. But my power hammer has a diversion valve on it, so you can turn the whole thing right down. So I was welding all of this as gently as humanly possible with the tool I had. It was appropriate for the size of the material, because I've taken that tool and tried to do ordinary work and just destroyed my work.
Would you say that the actual weight, the moving mass of the hammer, still plays a role in actually sort of powering through the material so you get the weld staking?
I don't think you need much force for the welding. So forge welding really is an exercise in putting as little force as you can to join the material as many times as you can. Otherwise you squish it too much, the whole thing just gets completely destroyed. So there's my one side of my sword billet. You can see we've got parallel layers running down, and then we've got the twist at whatever point they're stopped in their twisting, showing layers going in different directions. So I'll put that to the side. That's one side, and hopefully my cutting into this has not given me problems. I'll put this together. Now I have to have a little memory thing going on here that I'm fairly certain. Can't really see it. Yeah, I put steel on the inside, wrought iron on the outside, so that I end up with a wrought iron showing against the edge material, which was a very high layer steel, which I still have to make. So this is forging with a press rather than a hammer.
So when you're looking at force in forge welding, how do you feel about the difference between a press? Like I've heard that when you're pressing, you actually, it seems when you're pressing like you're having the force happen in the center of the billet before it comes to the outside, and when you're hammering with a lighter hammer, you're stretching the outside.
Yeah, they do different things, definitely. From a maker's point of view, it's whatever tool you're used to. And I've heard it said that A hand hammer is the worst thing you could possibly forge welding with, and then a power hammer and then a press being the best. Quite possibly it is. A rolling mill is definitely the best.
Yeah.
But for this kind of work, I'm used to using power hammers. And certainly don't get problems using them. And with a big power hammer, you have force going right to the core of the material. So it's acting a bit like a press and a power hammer. I'm having to be quite careful with this piece because I've gone and cut them, so I want to make sure that the bits I cut go on the inside of this sword blade, I think. Now, one of the big noticeable differences of working in plasticine rather than steel is that this stuff's floppy. And the steel at the thickness I was working at, which is pretty much identical to the thickness I'm working here, wasn't at all. It stayed pretty stiff. So I've got my two sides of the blade. I forged them down to quite different dimensions. I'll go and size this one to match using another hydraulic press action. Yeah, that's the one. Now let's take a cut so we can have a look at what's going on at the end. So I've got my 6 layers on one side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with a weird thing going on because I'd cut through the bar, and then 5 layers on this side. And that's the core for the sword. A representative for the core piece that would have been at the tip of the sword. I'll put these bits over there because you can see them. So I'm now faced with making an edge piece to forge weld to this. At this point here, both of these are separate, so I'm going to just quickly go and take them and forge weld them together, because that's what I did in the original sword piece, to have a single core billet. Let me just have a little reference here, because I wanted to have the cut pieces on the inside. I think it's that way. I think. So I'm going to forge weld these together. And all the way through the forging, I'm very carefully trying to make sure that I'm applying force in both of the planes. So when I press the material out, I press it back in, keep control of the shape, and try and keep everything parallel. A real disaster, probably not a problem in plasticine to be quite honest, but a disaster in steel is if you end up with parallelogram or non-parallel faces, or parallel faces that are not standing on top of each other. So there's my core, and I'm just going to prep it to the shape of a sword tip by grinding away with a kitchen knife.
So Owen, this pattern seems extremely complex. How does the complexity of this pattern compare to historically what you find, or even what you find today among sword makers?
On both counts, yeah, they exist as complex as this or more complex. Not much more complex, but a little bit. I mean, there are historical and modern swords that are more tricksy than this. And there's an element of the patterns in the original swords being possibly a proof of material quality, so that you're looking at a sword blade that has ornately twisted convoluted patterns up the middle of it, which is a kind of proof to the quality of the iron and steel that was used in a blade. You can't twist material like this unless it's of a good quality. But the patterns are being taken way beyond that. They're taken into something completely different. The swords with really, really fine patterns in were definitely being made as items to show off wealth and possibly prowess. Great thing for drunk guys around a table to boast about. My sword has more layers than yours.
I ask why did you decide to grind the tip of the core and not fish melt it or forge it?
I wanted to see the pattern ending dead as it was coming down. And at this level, if distortion might have been nice, but I'd rather just have the pattern as it is within the edge. So talking of the edge, I'm going to start working on that now. I've got the piece I made earlier, which I believe is 2 folds. I need quite a lot of material to edge around this blade, so I'm going to make up some more layered pieces. I'll probably grab you over again, Jake, to forge them together for me.
Do you want me to start forge welding?
Yes, please. And if you want to give that a
Hammer.
couple of folds over there.
Fold this twice?
Yes, please. Now we're working on separate smaller pieces and getting the layer count up by making smaller billets and then putting them together, and that's what I did in the original blade. Even with a very large power hammer, you reach a limit of the material you can efficiently work underneath the hammer. And certainly if you were attempting to do something like this, not of this scale, but any kind of forge welding like this by hand, then you'd be better off making smaller billets and combining them at the very end of the process. Now, plasticine does not behave in exactly the same way as steel as far as the differentiation between the two materials. So I'd expect if I got this up to the layer count that I got in the sword, which is 500, that we'd end up with a smushy grey, sort of blurred pattern. But I think if we aim for something like 200, 250 layers, I'm hoping at this thickness of material that we can still see a decent pattern. So the actual sword had about 500 layers in the edge, and I'm aiming for something like 250. Is that 1 fold or 2?
1 fold.
If you could fold it again, please. And I'm starting with 12 layers, taking them up to 48, and we'll try and get 5 bundles of that together to make the edge.
Can you start spudging these guys together?
Do that one with 2 folds, please. 6, 7, 8. I'm being kind of pedantic about counting this, and it doesn't really matter, but it certainly does in a piece you're making of steel. The whole process of pattern welding is one where you have to check and check and check what you're doing. All the bars that I made, I cut them to size and then I etched them before I put them together so that I wasn't running the risk of having completely messed something up. Which I've done before. Yeah, I've done a very good job of doing that before. I'll start working these down. So we're getting 48 layers, and we'll combine them as 5, lots of 48 layers. And from a historical perspective, this folding and forge welding is certainly a way to take bloomery material and amalgamate it to make it uniform, to squirt out some of the crud, some of the slag and some of the charcoal impurities that would have been in the piece. From a modern point of view, it's really just a homage to these ancient and beautiful processes, because when you're making something from modern steel, the steel you start with is as good as you need, and certainly better than anything historically that would have been available to anyone.
Maybe you can explain what bloomery material is, just for people who don't know.
Okie dokie. I do a lot of smelting as an interest of mine within the craft, and smelting is a process where you take iron ore and make it into iron or steel, and which we did in Arctic Fire 2013. You end up with a very cruddy slag rich material that is iron or steel and slag, and to actually make it into a usable block of steel or iron that you'd recognise as a piece of metal, you have to fold it and squash it together. But it's the historical material that most sword blades would have been made from up until somewhere between the 14th and 17th century, depending on where you were in the world, with exceptions, possibly. So we've got almost all our blocks here to make the monster edge bar. May be big enough, it may not. How you doing, Jake?
Good, the last hole.
Cool. Thank you very much. So we've got almost 250 layers, 5 lots of 48 layer material here, and I'll just take a cut down the end of it so you can see what's going on once I've squashed it. Yeah, this is going to be a hard forging job. So it's interesting, even in plasticine, it's not something that happens quickly. It's not something that happens easily. So I have a choice with this material because I've got layers going through it, whether I want to have the layers showing on the face of the blade or not. And I'm going to choose to not have the layers showing on the face. I could put it that way or this way. Yeah.
So Nick asked, when folding bloomery material, are you disturbing carbon through the material or homogenizing the material by dispersing the flaws in it?
What was the first part of that, please?
When folding bloomery material, are you disturbing carbon throughout the material or are you homogenizing the material by dispersing the flaws in it?
You're doing both. In most bloomery material, you have an uneven carbon content. So you may have ultra high carbon steel, pure iron. And you're trying to mix them all together to homogenize the carbon content, and you're also literally just squirting yeah, squirting the slag out of it, beating the crap out of it.
So if you're forging blue-green material in a charcoal fire, are you also carburizing the material somewhat?
I don't think so. But that's one of those things that people differ on.
Yeah.
My experience is that whilst you may be carburizing something in a fire, in some cases the net result is always carbon loss.
Right.
So you certainly can add or take away carbon in a coal fire or a gas forge,
Yeah.
if you set it correctly. But in my experience, that's not what happens. I think I might be close.
Do you ever use clay coating for consolidating glue?
I don't, but it would certainly make a difference. So I've got a little bit of a twist going on in this piece with my rough forging. So we'll see a change in the pattern as it happens around the piece. So I've got a relatively linear layer distribution on that end. When we turn it around this way, it's been squished over. So if this was a piece I was making, I would probably try to round it and twist the whole thing so it's straight. But as it's a great big lump of plastic, I think it's going to look all right as is.
That's something that easily happens when you...
It is, yeah, absolutely. Which is why if I was making the real piece, I'd etch the ends and check, because I'd much rather remake this in a steel piece, especially something of that scale. Me spending a day remaking this edge piece would be much better than me wasting 15 days worth of work. Or at least wasting it from my own point of view. Something like that is one of those things that if you're making forge welded pieces, I do wonder whether half of the stuff that goes into these is not noticed by anyone other than me or us. And us out there, I'll take everyone in on that. But for the rest of the world, I mean, you can put an awful lot of work into stuff that people just do not understand. So I haven't quite got enough material to cover the whole of the end of this, but I think for the point of what we're doing, it's going to make my point. This is my edge wrap, wrapped around the core. In some cases, in an ancient blade, it would be sort of some kind of samurai steel thing going over a core that was mainly iron or phosphoric iron. In this sword here, the whole thing is carbon steel apart from the grey wrought iron edges running down one side. So I'm going to forge weld this edge to the core, do a little bit of forging to pull some pattern into the edge, and then I'll cut into it and we'll see what I've actually got. So I've got to be careful I don't do this too hard because the material's quite soft. But I'd start by hitting the centre, forge welding that in, taking around the edge, and trying to mirror the action of the anvil on the billet to the action that my hammer's doing. Forge back down. And for me, the forge welding of a piece of material is one where you're forging backwards and forwards in your dimensions. You're squashing it into itself in one dimension, turning it 90 degrees, and pushing it back. So that you can massage any flux or differences in the corners of the edges. You can massage them all together. It's a bit like being one of those Turkish felt makers. So that's my rough forged sword tip. I've got my steel around the outside and my different patterns on there. Now I could just cut into this, but there's a couple of things that seem blatantly obvious at the moment. Is the edge is very, very narrow, and that I haven't got an awful lot of pattern going on in the edge. So certainly on the tip of the original piece I forged down. To shape the whole piece and also trying to cause some distortion in the random pattern material at the very edge. And I've left this ridiculously thick. I've got a bit of a weld delamination there, so let's go back over that.
Flux is on the table.
Yeah, it's self-fluxing, this stuff. It'll be the wrought iron in that tooth layer. Has a little bit of silicates in it. But if that had happened, that's exactly how I'd go about fixing it. I'd just work it backwards and forwards. I've left this piece very, very thick. And part of the reason in plasticine why I've left it this thick is that I want it to support its own weight. And if I tried to knock this down to an inch thick as a piece, it would be flopping all over. This would be a wonderful thing to do in hot steel.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to work this a little bit until I get something that I recognise as a sword tip. Well, that was definitely the case in the giant sword, Undertow bloody ripper of tides, is that it started off being a bloody great big lump of metal. And in the process of actually forging the tip, for me, it started becoming a sword. Because the form of it and the way it was behaving started being like a sword that weighs 2.5 pounds would have been. Up until that point, it was just a bloody great exercise in forge welding. So I've got some of my forging into the edge. I want to stretch the tip material out a bit.
Important comment from online. Martin Carter says you have a cracking mustache.
Well, thank you.
It's cracking.
I do like a good tash. Okie dokie. So I'm going to take that as being a job done for this piece. And having a look on the outside of it, there's not an awful lot going on in the patterns. We've got kind of cloudy looking material on the outside edge. I can't really see the teeth. They may not be too dramatic in this. It's going to be interesting to actually see. They work quite nicely in the steel piece. They had a subtlety, but still had a visibility that I quite liked. I'm going to cut into the edges. The knife, the kitchen knife, and my homemade scraping tool are representing grinding material off. So on one side of this, the side with 2 parallel layers and a more subtle kind of pattern going on in it, I don't really mind how deeply I cut into it. On the other side, it's pretty critical. I want to try and get those loops. So the problem with plasticine for this kind of thing is that if I don't cut a really clean line with a sharp knife, it'll smear. So let's see what I can do. Start on this side with a core. I'm just going to remove some material, create a fuller. There's my removed material. That would be a beautiful thing to see in a sword. You don't get that because it ends up being dust on the floor. I just want to take this fuller out a little bit further. And this is going to be one of those fullers that isn't a pure radius, as I think so few of them actually are. From a historical perspective, the 8 or 9 inch grinding wheels made of rubber with abrasives over them were few and far between. And I'm going to cut into the random pattern material, this 250 odd layer bar, and expose something that's going on there. And it's looking pretty nice and tight, actually, nice and subtle, which is what I'd want. I often look at a saw blade as a canvas, and I quite like to have the elements of it having some contrast in there, so that we're dealing with very, very fine things that you have to put your eye up close to, and then very bold patterns that are visible from a distance, that your enemy would see across the battlefield. Well, with something like that, all the way across the battlefield. So that's one side kind of roughed out. This is a rough grind, not a perfectly finished sword grind, but we're seeing pattern. This is the easy side because it has pattern that I believe will look good at every layer. The other side has pattern that looks good at every layer, but if I want to get what I want to get out of it, I'm going to have to be quite specific with the depth of my cut. So I'm not going to go too deep to start with. So cutting through there, I've got stars. And the stars look good. There are stars on the sword as I left them. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to cut down to a point where I get the loops in this pattern, because that's what I'm aiming for. So that would be acceptable, and I think it's very pretty, but it's not what I'm aiming for. That's very, very close. So I'm starting to get loop patterns. Now the complicated thing about this is that I've got the loop pattern on this side, but I haven't on that side. So I'm going to take another cut just to work it over. And the area of the sword that I got the pattern that I was very happy with, I was splashing it with dilute ferric chloride and then grinding a little bit and then splashing it with ferric chloride and then grinding a bit deeper. Because this pattern doesn't exist for a great depth through this material. So it's possible with that cut I will have overshot it. No, I've got it in some places. I'm happy to leave that as a river running through the centre. At the moment I can see my teeth over here, but I'm going to try and take a slightly shallower cut and see if we can clean that up a little bit. Much better. Now I did kind of accidentally end up making probably the most complicated pattern welded piece I've done whilst making this sword, and that really wasn't my intention to start with, because it would have been a ridiculous thing as a challenge to set myself. But we all like a nice challenge, don't we? There we have it. Under tip. Bloody ripper of tides tip in plasticine. One side that's got a pretty bling pattern, and one side that has got a subtle pattern, but in plasticine it looks pretty bling. So thank you very much.